Sometime after the Babylonian exile, a group of priests returning from Babylon began drastically altering the ancient religion of the Israelites, igniting a feud which divided the nation and set brother against brother. They were called unclean. They were called apostates. They were called idolaters. But the reformers had the financial backing of an empire, and eventually they gained control of the Jerusalem temple. History was rewritten to favor their cause, and the old ways were... I'm sorry, I'm getting into a topic best left for another episode. I'll get back on track. The Book of Judges is part of that fictive history. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. Chapter 17 tells us of a man named Micah, whose mother took 200 shekels of silver and had them melted down and formed into a molten image, which Micah kept in his house. This molten image would have served as Micah's god, to which he would make small daily offerings. These would later be called idols, but at the time when this story was first told, possessing such a figure and making personal offerings to it wasn't at all strange or blasphemous. It was the norm. In the days when this story was first told, the idea that worship had to be centralized in one temple and images were blasphemous was completely unheard of. In fact, much of the Old Testament, including the Book of Judges, is a pseudo-history cobbled together by multiple groups of editors in order to hide the nation's true origins for a variety of reasons. And the prohibition of idols and personal shrines played a major role in those reforms. But that's a topic for another episode. So Micah had his own little god, but we're not told how it looked or which deity it represented. If this story predates the Babylonian exile, then his silver idol could have been a winged bull with a human head, a winding serpent, a man with a spear, or about 50 other different images most people today would certainly not associate with Judaism. We also read here that Micah had a house of God, an ephod, and teraphim. The house of God means a dedicated room or building for worship. People would set these aside for their deities to inhabit and provide a place for them to sit quietly and pray or worship. The ephod was a special garment that was worn by the priests, and we get a description of this in Exodus, though it's doubtful that Micah's was anywhere near as elaborate. And the teraphim, those were small idols. This all indicates that Micah was a local oracle, prophet, or priest. We now think of these as three distinct titles, but that wasn't always the case. For a time, priests were understood to be prophets and oracles, and sometimes even more. Before the exile, some of those priests were also kings, and those kings were understood... Again, I'm getting ahead of myself and into the topics for another episode. Let me get back on track. So, Micah was a type of priest with his own shrine and idols in a time before monotheism had taken over and worship was centralized. One day, a young Levite from Bethlehem of Judah came to him, and Micah asked if the man would serve in his shrine. The man agrees, and it's said that the young man was like a priest and a father to Micah. Now, there are a few things to unpack here. First, it says that the Levite came from Judah, and Micah instantly asked if he could be a priest. In later stories, Levites were their own clan, but before the reform, they weren't a separate tribe, but a class of priests. Every tribe had Levites because every tribe had priests. This is why you have Levites coming from Judah. He was a Judahite, a man from the tribe of Judah, who served as a priest in the old Semitic religion before the reform. After the reform, when shrines such as these were banned and closed down, these priests would be relocated to Jerusalem, where they would be given new jobs as temple workers and a new history to cover up the nation's polytheistic origins. This also explains why a young man could be like a father to Micah. He wasn't a worldly role model for Micah, but a guide in spiritual matters, possessing of knowledge and wisdom. Priests were oracles and fathers and leaders, not just people who took your money in exchange for blessings. Now, all of this shows that Micah was either ready for retirement or didn't really see himself as a priest. He had a working shrine where the locals came for worship, but he wasn't interested in continuing his role as its keeper. We could speculate on his reasonings for this, but the text gives no real hint. Sometime later, and we're not told how long, the tribe of Dan was looking for a place to settle because, and I quote, no lot of land had been given to them. But if you remember anything from the book of Joshua, it's that every single tribe was allocated a portion of the promised land, and the topic was revisited and repeated ad nauseum. Because these are patchwork stories edited by different groups of scribes for different reasons, they're not always aware of the details provided in other books. So here, the Danites are latecomers, arriving on the scene to find no empty place to settle. The editor of this particular patch of tales is trying to paint the Danites as another Israelite tribe, despite their mysterious origins, and invents a reason for their late settlement that completely contradicts the story told by other scribes. So the tribe of Dan sends out 5 men from their clan seat in Zorah to search for suitable land to settle. Wait, they have a city in the middle of their land which serves as a clan seat, but they don't have land? Maybe it's one of those floating cities that just hovers in the sky? So we'll go with that and pretend that this story makes sense. So 5 men are sent out from the flying city of Zorah to find a place for their own town to land and come across Micah's house and the Levite priest who now lives there. While visiting, they ask the priest if their mission to find land will be successful. The Levite personally consults Yahweh, who assures them that they will indeed find land. The scouts come to the land of Laish, which is filled with unsuspecting people who, according to chapter 18, verse 7, are peaceful and do not molest the scouts. They report back to the Danites that they have found a suitable landing spot for their flying city, and the Danites instantly make the decision to invade. They march an army toward Laish and abduct the Levite priest along the way to serve as their priest. The Levite steals the ephod and the household gods, along with the sculpted silver image from Micah's house before his departure. Micah caught up to them sometime later and informed them that they stole his priest and his gods, but the Danite army doesn't really seem to care, so Micah returns home empty-handed. The Danites then butcher the unsuspecting people of Laish and put the entire population to the sword. So again, we have Yahweh endorsing genocide. Then something interesting occurs. Judges 18 verses 29 to 30 states that the Levite priest Jonathan, son of Gershom, son of Manasseh, which is another name for Moses, served as their priest in the new city they built, and his descendants served there, and I quote, until the time of the exile. So the book of Judges, supposedly recording events prior to 1000 BCE, is here mentioning events from 586 BCE. In fact, every book of the Old Testament contains elements that point to exilic or post-exilic periods. So while many contain stories which are obviously far older, they reach their final form only after being compiled and redacted during the Second Temple period. Despite what some apologists have claimed, we have 0 Old Testament manuscripts from the First Temple period. Even the Psalms, some of the oldest parts of the Hebrew Bible, show obvious signs of redaction by post-exilic editors. And there's a good reason for that. Those manuscripts were all either edited or destroyed. They weren't destroyed by the Assyrians or the Babylonians, but by the priests of the Second Temple. But again, I'm getting off topic. Back to Judges. Now, if you've been paying attention, you'll have noticed that Micah hasn't actually done anything, and yet he's listed as one of the judges. Why is he even included? It's because his role is mainly that of a prophet and a priest. In 1831, it says that, and I quote, they maintained the sculpted image that Micah had made throughout the time that the house of God stood at Shiloh. Obviously, Micah was a respected prophet in his time, since his name is given here for the pedigree for this particular sculpted image in the shrine at Shiloh. It was important to the people that they remember who made this particular image that they worshipped. This wasn't just any silver idol. This was a god created by Micah, and this is the story of how it came to be in this location, far from where it was made. Of course, this story might just be an invention to give a grand origin to a simple idol, just as one Ethiopian church once invented a grand story to explain the origin of their replica of the Ark of the Covenant, inspired by the description in Exodus. Micah wasn't a judge or a leader of any kind, at least not according to the story that survives, but his name was important enough to be remembered, so he gets a mention here in the book of Judges. Now, the last part of the book of Judges is one of the most disturbing stories in the entire Bible, and considering some of the topics we've already covered, that's saying something. This tale begins in Judges 19 with the story of the Levite and the concubine, and carries through until the end of the book in chapter 21 with the restoration of the tribe of Benjamin. Like the story of Micah, we again have a Levite found up in the hill country of Ephraim, but here he takes a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah, but she apparently wasn't too fond of the man because she instantly leaves him and returns to her father's house. So the Levite sets out with a servant and a couple of donkeys and attempts to bring her back. After several days, he leaves her father's house with the concubine in tow. Now, he's traveling near Jerusalem, though the story tells us that at this time it was still named Jebus. However, if you recall the earlier episodes, the city was either conquered or destroyed, or just settled by Israelites, and then renamed prior to this. So we have another instance of a story disconnected from time and dropped into a random spot in the timeline. So the Levite and his concubine and servant stop in the Benjaminite town of Gibeah for the night because they didn't want to sleep near the Jebusites. However, there was no room for them at the inn in Gibeah, so they make camp in the middle of town. But an old man offers them a place to crash in his own house. In the middle of the night, a depraved group of Benjaminites approach the man's house and demand that he turn over his guests. This seems abhorrent to the old man, so they offer his virgin daughter and the concubine instead. Sound familiar? This is the story of Sodom we encountered in the book of Genesis. We're not sure what the original tale was meant to convey, but two different groups have adopted this story and used it to explain very different events. One group used it to describe the destruction of a settlement due to geological catastrophe, while the other used it to explain tribal warfare. Unfortunately for the women in this version, there are no angels to appear to frighten off the crowd. The old man seizes the concubine and shoves her out the door and into the clutches of the waiting crowd. Apparently he forgot all about the promise of his virgin daughter and leaves her alone. Again, as in the Sodom tale, we have no mention of homosexuality. If that was the moral of the story, the author might have thought to mention it, but instead we have the sin of violating guest rights. It seems that they wanted to attack the foreigner, but would settle for raping his wife. So the crowd rapes the concubine throughout the night while her husband sleeps peacefully inside the house. At dawn, he finds her dead on the threshold of the old man's house. Being a callous bastard, he doesn't mourn her death or show anger at her hours of suffering, but instead simply tosses her corpse over the back of his donkey and takes her home, where he chops her into pieces and sends each part to a different tribe of Israel as proof of the barbarism of the tribe of Benjamin. Yeah, so that's pleasant. Everyone who sees the dismembered body parts grows angry at the evil act that has occurred and decides to take action. They come together with an army of 400,000 soldiers and assemble before Yahweh himself to decide what that action should be. But I'd say that showing up with 500,000 soldiers is a clear indicator that they've already decided what they're going to do. We also have Yahweh physically present and presiding over an army, another nod to his war god origins that we've already become familiar with. So the people ask Yahweh which tribe should march against the 26,000 soldiers of Benjamin, and he instructs them to send the tribe of Judah. So the tribe of Judah attacks the tribe of Benjamin, but they lose 22,000 men and must retreat. So obviously Yahweh wasn't doing such a great job as a tactician. Again, they ask Yahweh what to do, and Yahweh directly commands the attack. But again, they suffer defeat, this time losing 18,000 men to the grossly outnumbered Benjaminites. Looking for someone to blame other than their divine leader who made 2 bad calls in a row, they decide instead to blame themselves for losing and begin fasting and making burnt offerings, because the best way to fight effectively is weak and delirious from hunger. At this point, Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, was the priest at that time, and appealed to Yahweh on behalf of Israel and convinced him to aid them in their battle. They must have pleased Yahweh, because this time they defeat the Benjaminites, but it's also said that they ambushed them, so perhaps utilizing a battle plan might have helped. It says that 25,100 Benjaminites of the original 26,000 were killed that day, and the Israelites then went into the city and slew another 18,000 civilians. And then, wait, hang on a second. Phinehas, son of Eleazar and grandson of Aaron? Where have I heard that name before? Oh, the book of Numbers back in episodes 24 and 25. But that was a long time ago. Now, I don't mean a long time since I recorded those episodes, but a long time in the biblical timeline. Since becoming the high priest, Israelites had a 40-year wandering through the desert, which supposedly killed off everyone except for Joshua and Caleb. Then there was the entire invasion and the war, which saw Joshua grow old and die. After that, a host of judges, who sometimes ruled for an entire generation, with full decades of time passing between the lives of one judge and the next. And Phinehas is alive through all of this? Either the biblical timeline is all wonky, which is a technical term for totally botched, or Phinehas is extremely long-lived and violates that 100-year lifespan, which supposedly took effect after the flood, but didn't really. Now, I won't bother you with the math, but I spent a few hours tracing the story from the first mention of Phinehas in the book of Numbers, where I assigned him an approximate age of about 20, until this scene in Judges chapter 20, and came up with an approximate age of 612. Now let's get back to the Benjaminites. The doomed tribe flees to the wilderness, but they lose another 7,000 people in a couple of battles as the other Israelite tribes pursue them. The gathered tribes go from town to town, putting men, women, and children to the sword along with all the livestock. The towns that are depopulated are then burned. It's the same type of campaign described in the book of Joshua, only this time the genocide is seen as evil, even though they're doing exactly as Yahweh had commanded. Remember, they consulted him numerous times. They realize that they're about to wipe out an entire tribe from existence and think that this might be a bad idea. Apparently, genocide is all right as long as it's committed against non-Jews. The assembled tribes had apparently taken an oath at some point in the past to never send their daughters to the Benjaminites, though it's never said when exactly this oath had been sworn. Because they had to put all women and children to the sword, it seemed that the tribe of Benjamin was now doomed to extinction. So they went to Bethel and gathered before Yahweh once more and asked why such a terrible thing had happened. If any of them had bothered to read their Bibles, they would know that it happened because Yahweh had commanded it and they obeyed that command. But since they didn't yet have a copy of the book, they had to ask their deity in person. So they build an altar and make offerings to Yahweh. Of course, according to other parts of the story, they're not supposed to have altars outside of Jerusalem. But here in Judges, Jerusalem is still called Jebus and filled with heathens, and Bethel is central, not Jerusalem. Rather than admitting that Yahweh's plan was a disaster, something evident by the first two defeats and the near annihilation of one of the 12 tribes of Israel, they look for a scapegoat. They also need virgin girls to send to Benjamin. So what they do is they pick a town who didn't have representatives at the first gathering when Yahweh addressed the army of 400,000 soldiers, and they decide that that town's absence from that meeting is the reason the entire plan was flawed from the beginning. So, to set all of the wrongs right, they attack that town and slaughter every man, woman, and male child. They then gather up all the little girls, 400 in total, and send them off to be raped by the surviving Benjaminites. But there still aren't enough girls for the 600 men, so they tell the Benjaminites to lie in wait near Shiloh and capture virgin girls who are going there for a festival. The Benjaminites do so and manage to abduct enough little girls so that each of them has a sex slave. You see, they couldn't willingly give over their daughters to the Benjaminites because that would break their vow, so they simply provided an opportunity for their daughters to be abducted. Breaking a promise would incur guilt. Rape and genocide do not. Now, what are we to make of this entire sequence? It's likely that this is a way to explain an old feud between the tribe of Benjamin and its neighboring tribes. Because of the feud, they wouldn't send their daughters to the other tribe. They wouldn't intermarry with them. But, because of an alliance they had made, they weren't going to wage an all-out war on them if the Benjaminites began kidnapping girls who were going off to Shiloh to dance. Such an offense could be overlooked if it kept the peace, especially if they had engaged in brutal wars prior to forming this alliance. But what's this about virgin girls of Israel going to a festival to dance? Where is that in Judaism? It seems a bit out of place. That's because it is out of place. It doesn't belong in modern Judaism. This is an old festival associated with virginity and women's puberty rights, which was given a fictive origin back in Judges chapter 11, verse 40, when Jephthah's daughter was sacrificed to Yahweh before she could be given to a man to marry. It's explained there that this is the reason maidens of Israel go off to a festival to dance for 4 days each year. It's another example of a pagan festival in practice that's given a Yahwistic pedigree, like circumcision, the scapegoat ritual, the Passover, or just about any other festival celebrated in the Jewish faith. All of this, all of the horrors in the book of Judges, are blamed on the fact that the people didn't have a king to guide them, so they just did whatever they wanted. It's a literary way of setting the stage for the arrival of the Jewish monarchy. Though the monarchy which arrives in the story is significantly different from the one we know actually existed. This is because the authors of the Deuteronomic history, which includes Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, didn't actually support the idea of a Jewish monarchy. Now, they couldn't deny it existed, as it was an important part of their history. But the old idea of royalty was troublesome for their new government and new theology. How could a king be a problem for their theology? That has to do with who, or rather what, they once believed their kings were. Before the destruction of the first temple, before the Babylonian exile, the view of the monarchy was... Once again, I'm getting into a topic best left for another episode, which I promise is coming soon. This wraps up the Book of Judges, but I have a little listener mail to get to. Alex says, "Hello, love the podcast. I came from Blurry Photos after they mentioned you on an episode, so I hope you two can collaborate sometime. I was just wondering, in your episode about the Garden of Eden, you talked about how its creation was possibly inspired by climate change in the area several thousand years ago, and was used to justify the shift from matriarchy to patriarchy. You also used the example of modern-day tribes going through the same shifts. This is just something that really interests me, and I was hoping to get some sources on that or some further reading. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the next episode. Thank you, Alex. A few people have now asked for Blurry Photos crossover. Now, I don't think I'm big enough to swim in that pond, but if you do, then suggest it to David Flora. And I suppose I should thank him for sending so many listeners my way, yourself included. Now, the primary source for much of that information comes from a book called Saharasia, that's spelled Saharasa, by James DeMeo. Now, I need to mention a disclaimer here. A fair amount of that book seems to be speculation that's tinted with author bias. So don't go into it looking for great information. And that's the reason it's not listed on my site as one of the resources. However, a multitude of legitimate sociological and anthropological studies are cited in that book, so you can use it as a sort of index to track down some good peer-reviewed studies. And that should get you on the right track. Next up, we have Kevin. Kevin says, "Hey, love the podcast and the new site. Really glad to have a list of books to read as well. I share your passion in these studies. Well done, sir. Keep it up, and thanks." Thank you, Kevin. I will be updating that list of books very soon, so be sure to check out the website in the near future. Also want to thank all of you who gave me good reviews on iTunes. Dragons in Genesis has some good 5-star reviews, and that is a great way to give back to the show. Until next time, please like us on Facebook at facebook.com/dragonsingenesis. Check out the new website at dragonsingenesis.com, where you can send me any questions or comments that you might have. Subscribe and give us a good review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. And as always, thank you for listening.